So before jumping into 3D to talk about render layers and Vray object properties, let's talk about filtering and anti-aliasing and how they actually relate to utility render elements. I'm going to jump in File, Open, go to our project root, Nuke, and then I'm going to jump into Chapter 11, Depth of Field, Motion Blur Start. And this is actually the Nuke file for the next lesson, but we're going to take a look at it right now. So I'm going to set the project path, project directory really quick to relink up all our renders. And if we take over here on this left side, I'm just going to make sure that we're setting our knob defaults before we get started. And we have a couple different renders. We have this render that has filtering, and we notice that we have this no filtering utils. Same thing with this. So standard rendered and then a no filtering utils. And when I say no filtering utility passes, what I mean by is if we check out these edges here, and if we jump into something like the UV pass, we'll notice that they look jagged. That is no filtering. So what is filtering? What is anti-aliasing? Anti-aliasing is essentially the process of rendering a pixel multiple times, and filtering is the process of averaging those pixels together. So this pixel that we kind of see this orangish, whitish tint, so we see obviously there's some transparency happening here. So we see part of the teapot, we see part of the background. That's anti-aliasing and filtering. So with utility passes, it's kind of common to see them rendered with no filtering like this. And it can work in certain cases, but in my experience, more often than not, they can be more problematic than what they're worth. And if you're wondering how to set up your render elements to be no filtering, if we jump into Maya, jump into the render globals, render elements, and if we just check out any utility render element, we can see that we have a filtering option here. So these no filtering passes were rendered with no filtering on all of the render utility elements. So let's take a look at some examples of both of these. So we'll start over here and we'll just do a UV pass. So I'll drop in a shuffle node. I'm going to shuffle out our UV pass. I'm going to drop in a checkerboard, an ST map, and I'm going to map those together. So UV channels are RGBA, and I'm going to jump back to our RGBA channel, and you'll notice we got our UV map. So if we check out our edges, you notice we are kind of sort of getting some decent results. And if we flip over to our filtered, so if we check out the UV pass over here, it has the anti-aliasing baked in. And you notice that although the edges are smoother, they become very interactive. They are transparent, so they're essentially mixing between the foreground and background and giving us this kind of like weird aliased edge. So no filtered solves everything, right? Well, you can see that this edge doesn't have any anti-aliasing going on. So therefore, it is not going to be one-to-one with our image that we see here. So we see a smooth edge here. Now we're getting a jagged edge. And if we switch these UV passes, you'll see now we're getting a smooth edge, which is matching our beauty pass, but now we're getting some weird jaggediness that's happening here. So what's the solution here? If both of these results are giving us flawed information, how do we solve this problem? Well, number one, always keep your multipass compositing subtle. You don't want to go too extreme. The cover image is a pretty extreme result, and you can get that far if you really know what you're doing. But when you're first starting out, I wouldn't just plan on replacing textures like this. Those are the kind of things that you want to do towards the end of the project. With that said, there are ways around this, and the ways around this is really to use render layers. And what we can do is actually separate these out, and we'll keep the render elements filtered, but we'll be able to unpre-multiply them, which will give us essentially an extruded non-filtered edge, which alleviates a lot of these bigger picture problems. So let's jump over to Maya. I'm going to File, Open. I'm going to go to Depth of Field, Motion Blur Start. So depth of field, this is a pretty extreme case. Where we have this fence in front of us, and then we have our midground, and then we have our background. Let's jump back over to 2D, and let's see what happens when we actually throw a Z to focus on this. I'll drop in a Z to focus node. We're going to go over this again in our next lesson, so I'm going to go through this pretty quick. But I'm just going to pick a focal point, just like that, and really crank up our depth of field. And what we're going to see is we're going to start to get some pretty ugly edges. We're getting a lot of artifacting here, a lot of artifacting there. And if we switch this over to the no filtered version, although it's going to get better in some areas, other areas it's going to continue to get worse. So you see we're getting like these edges here, like that. Well, we're getting a lot of edging issues there. We are getting some improvements here, but you can even see right there how it's kind of like bleeding that orange into the background, which is absolutely not what we want. So how do we fix this? We fix this with render layers and V-Ray object properties. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to separate out our foreground, our midground, and our background. So let's jump back over to 3D and let's take a look at render layers. So we're using render layers, not render setup. So if you go to settings, preferences, before you open up this file, make sure that you have this switched over to preferred render setup system. We're choosing render layers, not render setup. There's going to be a bonus lesson to go over this workflow, but for now we're going to use a simple render layers version. So again, that's settings, preferences under the rendering tab. So let's set up our render layers. So essentially what we got to do is we got to separate out these objects. So our foreground, our midground, and our background. We got to render those completely separate and be able to merge them back over without coming up with a different result. We still want it to match our beauty one-to-one. So I'm going to select our lighting groups and our midground, foreground, background groups, and I'm going to go over to my channel box over here, go from display to render, and then we're going to create empty render layer. We'll jump up here, we'll just double click on this to rename it to foreground, just like that. I'm going to right click, add selections, so we add everything to that group. And now what we can do is we can start setting render stat flags, so we can actually say, hey, have this object not visible to the camera, but have it visible to everything else. So it'll still probably cast reflections, shadows, GI, and so on and so forth. So how do we set these render stats? If we go into our attribute editor over here, so from a channel box to attribute editor, we can jump to our mesh node and we have some render stat options here. And we could right click, create render layer override, and then toggle that primary visibility. And if you notice, if I drag off this attribute editor and if I switch back and forth, now that attribute override just lives on that one render layer, and you can do this with any attribute within Maya. So with that said, all we have to do now is make sure that all of our render stats are set up, but we don't really want to have to come in here and set our render stats on every single object, especially when we have things really nicely grouped like this. So what I'm going to do is go back to that mesh node and remove that render layer override flag. And what I'm going to do to replace that is use V-Ray object property sets. So if I jump back down to my master layer, I'm going to jump into create V-Ray object properties. Then I'm just going to tear off this tab while we're working. And for each one of our foreground, midground, background group, we're going to create a V-Ray object property set. So I'm going to click on foreground. We're going to do apply V-Ray, apply single object property to node selection right there. I'm just going to call this foreground VOP. And I'm going to do this same process for the midground and background. So apply and apply. And then we'll just rename this to midground VOP and background VOP. And VOP stands for V-Ray object properties. So now what we can do is jump back into our foreground group. And if we just take a look at this as an example, jump into the V-Ray object properties, we're noticing we're having some render stats down here. So these are very similar to the render stats that actually live on the mesh nodes themselves. So if we just right click, create render layer override, and turn off primary visibility, I'm going to fire up IPR, you'll notice that we have our fence and our background now showing up. So now all we have to do is get rid of our background. So if we just did a primary visibility override on this background, we're going to run into some issues, especially with this kind of stuff. They're not going to necessarily show up in this render, but for renders that you'll be doing in the future, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're cutting stuff like this off. So if I actually go down here and take a render right here, if we go to background, I'm going to primary visibility override, and then just give that a render. You notice, okay, looks great, right? But if we go into our alpha, you notice that we get this. essentially what's happening here is that our alpha is not being cut off because our set is just primary visibility off. So essentially what we're seeing down here is the underlying geometry that's going underneath the ground plane. And it's showing up black, not because it's being cut off, but because there's no light down there, which is why it's still showing up in the alpha pass. So what we actually want to do is actually cut that out. And the way we do that, if I stop IPR, if I go to my background VOP, I'll not do primary visibility override, but I'll actually use the matte surface properties. So if we use matte properties, I'm going to render layer override matte surface, alpha contribution, so I'll turn that on, and then I'll turn this to -1, then I'll turn off generate render elements. If you notice that if we render this, so our alpha is looking good now, but now we're getting all that information within our render element still, which is not what we want. So now if I jump back to my background VOP, I'll just right click render layer overrides and then turn that off. And now if we give this an IPR render, you can see our alpha is looking good and our render elements are all looking good. So we'll jump back into our render camera and give this a render. And you see we're getting exactly what we want. So we're still getting the reflections and everything from our scene. It's still interacting properly, but now it's completely separated out. So now all we got to do is create a midground layer and a background layer. So I'm going to select all my objects just like that. Create empty render layer. Add objects to selection. And then just call this midground. And then repeat that process. But now, essentially what we want to do is have the foreground VOP be primary visibility off. So we'll do render layer override, primary visibility off. We'll keep midground untouched for this layer, and then background VOP will do the same thing that we did before. So matte surface on, alpha contribution -1, and then generate render elements completely off. And if we give that a render, we'll see it's still interacting with the scene, it's still getting the shadows and everything, but now it's completely separate. And now we just want to repeat that process for the background. So I'll add everything to the background. So create empty render layer, add selected objects, rename that to background. And now all we gotta do is midground, and foreground we'll just do primary visibility off. So right click render layer override and right click render layer override. Just like that. Now if we give this a render, you'll see it's interacting, it's still casting the shadows onto the set, it's just rendered completely separate. Now if we just stop our IPR, and if we just give this a batch render, I already have these set up in Nuke, so I'm going to skip this process, but feel free to give this a batch render to render all these render layers out. And then in the next lesson, we're going to see how to combine all these render layers to give us a better control over our render elements, specifically with motion blur and depth of field.